Things Fall Apart, Chapter 5. The feast of the new yam was approaching, and Umuofia was in a festival mood. It was an occasion for giving thanks to Ani, the earth goddess, and the source of all fertility. Ani played a greater part in the life of the people than any other deity. She was the ultimate judge of morality and conduct, and what was more, she was in close communion with the departed fathers of the clan whose bodies had been committed to earth. The feast of the new yam was held every year before the harvest began, to honor the earth goddess and the ancestral spirits of the clan. New yams could not be eaten until some had first been offered to these powers. Men and women, young and old, looked forward to the new yam festival, because it began the season of plenty, the new year. On the last night before the festival, yams of the old year were all disposed of by those who still had them. The new year must begin with tasty fresh yams, and not the shriveled and fibrous crop of the previous year. All cooking pots, calabashes, and wooden bowls were thoroughly washed, especially the wooden mortar in which yam was pounded. Yam fufu and vegetable soup was the chief food in the celebration. So much of it was cooked that, no matter how heavily the family ate, or how many friends and relatives they invited from neighboring villages, there was always a large quantity of food left over at the end of the day. The story was always told of a wealthy man who set before his guests a mound of fufu so high that those who sat on one side could not see what was happening on the other, and it was not until late in the evening that one of them saw for the first time his in-law, who had arrived during the course of the meal and had fallen to on the opposite side. It was only then that they exchanged greetings and shook hands over what was left of the food. The New Yam festival was thus an occasion for joy throughout Umuofia, and every man whose arm was strong, as the Igbo people say, was expected to invite large numbers of guests from far and wide. Okonkwo always asked his wives' relations, and since he now had 3 wives, his guests would make a fairly big crowd. But somehow Okonkwo could never become as enthusiastic over feasts as most people. He was a good eater, and he could drink 1 or 2 fairly big gourds of palm wine, but he was always uncomfortable sitting around for days waiting for a feast, or getting over it. He would be very much happier working on his farm. The festival was now only 3 days away. Okonkwo's wives had scrubbed the walls and the huts with red earth until they reflected light. They had then drawn patterns on them in white, yellow, and dark green. They then set about painting themselves with cam wood and drawing beautiful black patterns on their stomachs and on their backs. The children were also decorated, especially their hair, which was shaved in beautiful patterns. The 3 women talked excitedly about the relations who had been invited, and the children reveled in the thought of being spoiled by those visitors from the motherland. Ikeme Funa was equally excited. The New Yam festival seemed to him to be a much bigger event here than in his own village, a place which was already becoming remote and vague in his imagination. And then the storm burst. Okonkwo, who had been walking about aimlessly in his compound in suppressed anger, suddenly found an outlet. "Who killed this banana tree?" he asked. A hush fell on the compound immediately. "Who killed this tree? Or are you all deaf and dumb?" As a matter of fact, the tree was very much alive. Okonkwo's second wife had merely cut a few leaves off it to wrap some food, and she said so. Without further argument, Okonkwo gave her a sound beating, and left her and her only daughter weeping. Neither of the other wives dared to interfere beyond an occasional and tentative, "It is enough, Okonkwo," pleaded from a reasonable distance. His anger thus satisfied, Okonkwo decided to go out hunting. He had an old rusty gun made by a clever blacksmith who had come to live in Umuofia long ago. But although Okonkwo was a great man whose prowess was universally acknowledged, he was not a hunter. In fact, he had not killed a rat with his gun. And so when he called Ikeme Funa to fetch his gun, the wife who had just been beaten murmured something about guns that never shot. Unfortunately for her, Okonkwo heard it, and ran madly into his room for the loaded gun, ran out again, and aimed it at her as she clambered over the dwarf wall of the barn. He pressed the trigger, and there was a loud report accompanied by the wail of his wives and children. He threw down the gun and jumped into the barn, and there lay the woman, very much shaken and frightened, but quite unhurt. He heaved a heavy sigh and went away with the gun. In spite of this incident, the New Yam festival was celebrated with great joy in Okonkwo's household. Early that morning, as he offered a sacrifice of new yam and palm oil to his ancestors, he asked them to protect him, his children, and their mothers in the new year. As the day wore on, his in-laws arrived from 3 surrounding villages, and each party brought with them a huge pot of palm wine. And there was eating and drinking till night, when Okonkwo's in-laws began to leave for their homes. The second day of the new year was the day of the great wrestling match between Okonkwo's village and their neighbors. It was difficult to say which the people enjoyed more, the feasting and fellowship of the first day, or the wrestling contest on the second. But there was one woman who had no doubt whatever in her mind. She was Okonkwo's second wife, Ekwefi, whom he nearly shot. There was no festival in all the seasons of the year which gave her as much pleasure as the wrestling match. Many years ago she was the village beauty. Okonkwo had won her heart by throwing the cat in the greatest conquest within living memory. She did not marry him then because he was too poor to pay her bride price, but a few years later she ran away from her husband and came to live with Okonkwo. All this happened many years ago. Now Ekwefi was a woman of 45 who had suffered a great deal in her time, but her love of wrestling contests was still as strong as it was 30 years ago. It was not yet noon on the second day of the New Yam festival. Ekwefi and her only daughter, Ezinma, sat near the fireplace waiting for the water in the pot to boil. The fowl Ekwefi had just killed was in the wooden mortar. The water began to boil, and in one deft movement she lifted the pot from the fire and poured the boiling water over the fowl. She put back the empty pot on the circular pad in the corner and looked at her palms, which were black with soot. Ezinma was always surprised that her mother could lift a pot from the fire with her bare hands. "Ekwefi," she said, "is it true that when people are grown up, fire does not burn them?" Ezinma, unlike most children, called her mother by her name. "Yes," replied Ekwefi, too busy to argue. Her daughter was only 10 years old, but she was wiser than her years. "But Nwoye's mother dropped her pot of hot soup the other day, and it broke on the floor." Ekwefi turned the hen over in the mortar and began to pluck the feathers. "Ekwefi," said Ezinma, who had joined in plucking the feathers, "my eyelid is twitching." "It means you are going to cry," said her mother. "No," Ezinma said. "It is this eyelid, the top one." "That means you will see something." "What will I see?" she asked. "How can I know?" Ekwefi wanted to work it out herself. "Oh ho!" said Ezinma at last. "I know what it is, the wrestling match." At last the hen was plucked clean. Ekwefi tried to pull out the horny beak, but it was too hard. She turned round on her low stool and put the beak in the fire for a few moments. She pulled again, and it came off. "Ekwefi!" a voice called from one of the other huts. It was Nwoye's mother, Okonkwo's first wife. "Is that me?" Ekwefi called back. That was the way people answered calls from outside. They never answered yes, for fear it might be an evil spirit calling. "Will you give Ezinma some fire to bring to me?" Her own children and Ika Mifuna had gone to the stream. Ekwefi put a few live coals into a piece of broken pot, and Ezinma carried it across the clean-swept compound to Nwoye's mother. "Thank you, Nma," she said. She was peeling new yams, and in a basket beside her were green vegetables and beans. "Let me make the fire for you," Ezinma offered. "Thank you, Ezebo," she said. She often called her Ezebo, which means the good one. Ezinma went outside and brought some sticks from a huge bundle of firewood. She broke them into little pieces across the sole of her foot and began to build a fire, blowing it with her breath. "You will blow your eyes out," said Nwoye's mother, looking up from the yams she was peeling. "Use the fan." She stood up and pulled out the fan, which was fastened into one of the rafters. As soon as she got up, the troublesome nanny goat, which had been dutifully eating yam peelings, dug her teeth into the real thing, scooped out 2 mouthfuls, and fled from the hut to chew the cud in the goat's shed. Nwoye's mother swore at her and settled down again to her peeling. Azimah's fire was now sending up thick clouds of smoke. She went on fanning it until it burst into flames. Nwoye's mother thanked her, and she went back to her mother's hut. Just then the distant beating of drums began to reach them. It came from the direction of the Ilo, the village playground. Every village had its own Ilo, which was as old as the village itself, and where all the great ceremonies and dances took place. The drums beat the unmistakable wrestling dance, quick, light, and gay, and it came floating on the wind. Okonkwo cleared his throat and moved his feet to the beat of the drums. It filled him with fire as it had always done from his youth. He trembled with the desire to conquer and subdue. It was like the desire for woman. "We shall be late for the wrestling," said Azimah to her mother. "They will not begin until the sun goes down." "But they are beating the drums." "Yes, the drums begin at noon, but the wrestling waits until the sun begins to sink. Go and see if your father has brought out yams for the afternoon." "He has. Nwoye's mother is already cooking." "Go and bring our own, then. We must cook quickly, or we shall be late for the wrestling." Azimah ran in the direction of the barn and brought back 2 yams from the dwarf wall. Ekwefi peeled the yams quickly. The troublesome nanny goat sniffed about, eating the peelings. She cut the yams into small pieces and began to prepare a pottage, using some of the chicken. At that moment they heard someone crying just outside their compound. It was very much like Obiageli, Nwoye's sister. "Is that Obiageli weeping?" Ekwefi called across the yard to Nwoye's mother. "Yes," she replied. "She must have broken her water pot." The weeping was now quite close, and soon the children filed in, carrying on their heads various sizes of pots suitable to their years. Ikemefuna came first with the biggest pot, closely followed by Nwoye and his 2 younger brothers. Obiageli brought up the rear, her face streaming with tears. In her hand was the cloth pad on which the pot should have rested on her head. "What happened?" her mother asked, and Obiageli told her mournful story. Her mother consoled her and promised to buy her another pot. Nwoye's younger brothers were about to tell their mother the true story of the accident when Ikemefuna looked at them sternly, and they held their peace. The fact was that Obiageli had been making inyanga with her pot. She had balanced it on her head, folded her arms in front of her, and began to sway her waist like a grown-up young lady. When the pot fell down and broke, she burst out laughing. She only began to weep when they got near the iroko tree outside their compound. The drums were still beating, persistent and unchanging. Their sound was no longer a separate thing from the living village. It was like the pulsation of its heart. It throbbed in the air, in the sunshine, and even in the trees, and filled the village with excitement. Ekwefi ladled her husband's share of the pottage into a bowl and covered it. Azimah took it to him in his obi. Okonkwo was sitting on a goatskin already eating his first wife's meal. Obiageli, who had brought it from her mother's hut, sat on the floor waiting for him to finish. Azimah placed her mother's dish before him and sat with Obiageli. "Sit like a woman!" Okonkwo shouted at her. Azimah brought her 2 legs together and stretched them in front of her. "Father, will you go to see the wrestling?" Azimah asked after a suitable interval. "Yes," he answered. "Will you go?" "Yes." After a pause she said, "Can I bring your chair for you?" "No, that is a boy's job." Okonkwo was specially fond of Azimah. She looked very much like her mother, who was once the village beauty, but his fondness only showed on very rare occasions. "Obiageli broke her pot today," Azimah said. "Yes, she has told me about it," Okonkwo said between mouthfuls. "Father," said Obiageli, "people should not talk when they are eating, or pepper may go down the wrong way." "That is very true. Do you hear that, Azimah? You are older than Obiageli, but she has more sense." He uncovered his second wife's dish and began to eat from it. Obiageli took the first dish and returned to her mother's hut. And then Nkechi came in, bringing the third dish. Nkechi was the daughter of Okonkwo's third wife. In the distance the drums continued to beat. Chapter 6. The whole village turned out on the Ilo, men, women, and children. They stood round in a huge circle, leaving the center of the playground free. The elders and grandees of the village sat on their own stools, brought there by their young sons or slaves. Okonkwo was among them. All others stood, except those who came early enough to secure places on the few stands which had been built by placing smooth logs on forked pillars. The wrestlers were not there yet, and the drummers held the field. They too sat just in front of the huge circle of spectators, facing the elders. Behind them was the big and ancient silk cotton tree, which was sacred. Spirits of good children lived in that tree, waiting to be born. On ordinary days, young women who desired children came to sit under its shade. There were 7 drums, and they were arranged according to their sizes, in a long wooden basket. 3 men beat them with sticks, working feverishly from one drum to another. They were possessed by the spirit of the drums. The young men who kept order on these occasions dashed about, consulting among themselves and with the leaders of the 2 wrestling teams, who were still outside the circle behind the crowd. Once in a while 2 young men carrying palm fronds ran round the circle and kept the crowd back by beating the ground in front of them or, if they were stubborn, their legs and feet. At last the 2 teams danced into the circle, and the crowd roared and clapped. The drums rose to a frenzy. The people surged forward. The young men who had kept order flew around, waving their palm fronds. Old men nodded to the beat of the drums and remembered the days when they wrestled to its intoxicating rhythm. The contest began with boys of 15 or 16. There were only 3 such boys in each team. They were not the real wrestlers, they merely set the scene. Within a short time the first 2 bouts were over, but the third created a big sensation, even among the elders, who did not usually show their excitement so openly. It was as quick as the other 2, perhaps even quicker, but very few people had ever seen that kind of wrestling before. As soon as the 2 boys closed in, one of them did something which no one could describe, because it had been as quick as a flash, and the other boy was flat on his back. The crowd roared and clapped, and for a while drowned the frenzied drums. Okonkwo sprang to his feet and quickly sat down again. 3 young men from the victorious boys' team ran forward, carried him shoulder high, and danced through the cheering crowd. Everybody soon knew who the boy was. His name was Maduka, the son of Obiarika. The drummers stopped for a brief rest before the real matches. Their bodies shone with sweat, and they took up fans and began to fan themselves. They also drank water from small pots and ate kola nuts. They became ordinary human beings again, talking and laughing among themselves and with others who stood near them. The air, which had been stretched taut with excitement, relaxed again. It was as if water had been poured on the tightened skin of a drum. Many people looked around, perhaps for the first time, and saw those who stood or sat next to them. "I did not know it was you," Ekwefi said to the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with her since the beginning of the matches. "I do not blame you," said the woman. "I have never seen such a large crowd of people. Is it true that Okonkwo nearly killed you with his gun?" "It is true indeed, my dear friend. I cannot yet find a mouth with which to tell the story." "Your chi is very much awake, my friend. And how is my daughter, Ezinma?" "She has been very well for some time now. Perhaps she has come to stay." "I think she has. How old is she now?" "She is about 10 years old." "I think she will stay. They usually stay if they do not die before the age of 6. "I pray she stays," said Ekwefi with a heavy sigh. The woman with whom she talked was Chielo. She was the priestess of Agbala, the oracle of the hills and the caves. In ordinary life Chielo was a widow with 2 children. She was very friendly with Ekwefi, and they shared a common shed in the market. She was particularly fond of Ekwefi's only daughter, Ezinma, whom she called my daughter. Quite often she brought bean cakes and gave Akwefi some to take home to Azima. Anyone seeing Chielo in ordinary life would hardly believe she was the same person who prophesied when the spirit of Agbala was upon her. The drummers took up their sticks, and the air shivered and grew tense like a tightened bow. The two teams were ranged facing each other across the clear space. A young man from one team danced across the center to the other side, and pointed at whomever he wanted to fight. They danced back to the center together, and then closed in. There were 12 men on each side, and the challenge went from one side to the other. 2 judges walked around the wrestlers, and when they thought they were equally matched, stopped them. 5 matches ended in this way. But the really exciting moments were when a man was thrown. The huge voice of the crowd then rose to the sky in every direction. It was even heard in the surrounding villages. The last match was between the leaders of the teams. They were among the best wrestlers in all the 9 villages. The crowd wondered who would throw the other this year. Some said Okafo was the better man. Others said he was not the equal of Ikezui. Last year, neither of them had thrown the other, even though the judges had allowed the contest to go on longer than was the custom. They had the same style, and one saw the other's plans beforehand. It might happen again this year. Dusk was already approaching when their contest began. The drums went mad, and the crowds also. They surged forward as the 2 young men danced into the circle. The palm fronds were helpless in keeping them back. Ikezui held out his right hand. Okafo seized it, and they closed in. It was a fierce contest. Ikezui strove to dig in his right heel behind Okafo so as to pitch him backwards in the clever Ege style. But the one knew what the other was thinking. The crowd had surrounded and swallowed up the drummers, whose frantic rhythm was no longer a mere disembodied sound, but the very heartbeat of the people. The wrestlers were now almost still in each other's grip. The muscles on their arms and their thighs and on their backs stood out and twitched. It looked like an equal match. The 2 judges were already moving forward to separate them when Ikezui, now desperate, went down quickly on one knee in an attempt to fling his man backwards over his head. It was a sad miscalculation. Quick as the lightning of Amadiora, Okafo raised his right leg and swung it over his rival's head. The crowd burst into a thunderous roar. Okafo was swept off his feet by his supporters and carried home shoulder high. They sang his praise, and the young women clapped their hands. "Who will wrestle for our village? Okafo will wrestle for our village. Has he thrown 100 men? He has thrown 400 men. Has he thrown 100 cats? He has thrown 400 cats. Then send him word to fight for us."